So yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, JustLabs is a relatively new collective. I'm one of several or a dozen sort of people who are part of this collective all over the world that come from many different fields. And our goal is essentially we want to change the DNA of the human rights movement. We don't accept the narrative of the current state we're in as a crisis or for our movement, but actually an opportunity to undertake the radical transformation that our movement needs to take using new technologies. Our logo is a paperclip because the whole idea of paperclip is a simple piece of steel that's bent into a new shape to bring people together. And that's what we want to do at the current moment. And one of our main focuses is populism and how do we help the human rights NGOs around the world who are working on it. But our principle also is that for us, the human rights movement is a global movement. It's about organizations working together. And we were very inspired by work by such as Narrative Initiative and frameworks and all the research coming out, Framework Institute. But we were looking at how can national NGOs who are being undermined by narratives respond. And one of the things we very quickly realized was if we're just responding to narratives and countering and myth busting, we're not really doing narrative. And so the title is inspired actually by a story that comes out of the book of Dan Pfeiffer, who was Barack Obama's communications director when they came up with their Be the Chain, with their Change You Can Believe In message. They were brainstorming all the different titles. And Obama, according to Pfeiffer, says, what you do is the message. And so the point was that they were comfortable with that message because Barack Obama himself embodied that change. And so our message to human rights organizations in our labs was you have to be the narrative. You can't just decide to start using some words. It's also about what is it actually that people will think of doing human rights. And so I'll take you through a little bit of the journey. So essentially we basically we brought together 12 human rights organizations from 12 different countries facing different levels of populist threat. So not just sort of the global south, but also the UK and Australia, where human rights policies are being undermined. And we're going on the basic principle here that actually, human rights itself exists in law, but actually people only obey those laws because of stories that people. Yeah, and so what populists are doing is undermining the norms that we thought were safe with the stories they're telling. And so what we want to look at is what are the stories we will now tell ourselves to reverse and put in place that new narrative. And so what we did within our labs, we held 4 different labs around in different locations with these organizations. And we were looking at trying to bring in some design thinking and experts from digital marketing and branding and political science. What are the actual stories we tell, the actual things these human rights organizations can do that if the story of what they do is told, will start to constitute that new narrative that actually newspaper articles, people posting on social media. So essentially a different idea of what it means to be a human rights organization. And a lot of the organizations in the labs were saying, we just want to even be able to say the word human rights and not sound like uncool, not sound just. So essentially, this is a project that the report speaks to the first phase of our project where we tried to brainstorm, get these new ideas out. We're now in a phase of experimentation in 4 countries, trying to roll these prototypes out and actually basically run narrative change campaigns. And at the end of the project, we will have a learning and dissemination phase where we will actually bring all of these findings to everyone and through a narrative hub actually share the examples of tactics and the narratives that worked. And I can come back to a little bit of that at the end. So we started off with some of the very simple tools such as sort of power mapping and things. But what was really worrying to us about this, we immediately saw that actually all of our allies are quite weak in terms of narrative power. So we knew that a lot of our work would have to be elevating those allies up into a higher quadrant where they, the people who share our narrative make their voice heard. But for that, we needed newer allies. And so we basically summarized a little bit the sort of dynamic here as we try to understand what is it about populism that's undermining our human rights NGOs. We know some of the basics, but like fundamentally, what are our core goals? And actually, once the sort of these mainly lawyers started to come around together, they started to actually put their finger on things like people don't want to take part anymore. We can have calm conversations. So there's not enough caring or empathy for each other anymore. And so actually, we then started to think of the challenge less in terms of shrinking space or laws or policies, but actually, what does it actually mean to do human rights? What are the end goals? And at the end of the day, we want a society where people take part, where people take care of each other. And that then we sort of identified, okay, the things that populists are doing, their narrative strategies are conflict, controversy, and chaos that create that sense of a society in conflict. And so a lot of the times we then play a role in that. So at first, the temptation of the organizations in these labs was the populists say one thing, our campaign will be all based on what they said. You say this, well, so one politician said charities in the UK should go back to their knitting. So the UK organization, they wanted to say, well, we knit together the social fabric, but just constantly being driven by what the actions and the words of our opponents. So instead, we ended up with a set of strategies that instead of responding and be always being goaded and basically trolled by populists, and attacking them back, which feeds their narrative of conflict, we came up with strategies of community cooperation and culture. So community being in it just in its own sake, reaching the people we're trying to reach in their own space. So in a bar where they watch football, just to actually be able to have for those conversations to happen that again are a fundamental part of what we want to see in the world, to have reach people through culture on a sort of apolitical level with our values. So in museums, in comedy clubs, and again, not just as a means to promote a policy or a campaign, but actually as an end in itself. And then finally, cooperation. So working with companies, newspapers, influencers, to again, not just to reach new people with our message in a different way, but again, just to actually have more of that cooperation in society. So those were actual tools, but they were also means in an end. Partly, so those basically those tactics are now starting to run out. But there are some other findings from the report, which is when we started talking about those new ways of doing human rights, the key words, the ingredients of those, what is a new narrative for human rights we can use? So we're trying to shift away. We realize like image of a protest is actually feeding again that sense of these angry people, they're divided, there's one side and the other, there's good people on both sides. And also shifting a little bit away from that traditional language of rights and actually focusing a bit more on the humanity aspect. Um, so for example, one of the prototypes that came out was from Mexico. Would be one of these spoofs where they show like an actor impersonates the president and has the president say, "Commit to all the things we want to do." Another example was so Instagram. So we actually within our labs were very put our human rights friends into a different sort of space, forcing them to like act things out and act out what the prototype would be. So in one case, there's a lot of people like posting to Instagram, doing things with companies. So we actually it was very key that people would be part of the narrative themselves. They would actually. So this is a sort of the head of an Australian legal NGO acting out, coming to the booth and telling their story as part of one campaign. Another example, hopefully, will be in Venezuela. They were going to take a food truck and turn it into a truck that would go and deliver rights to the community. In Hungary, they would take a YouTube influencer and have them tour the country and get young people to vote. One core thing that underlined is what we did afterwards was analyze the language we were using to describe these new activities, these new prototypes, and how are we actually talking about human rights? And that's the thing we really took away from work like narrative initiatives. Actually, we need to work on narrative, but it's also hard to actually do that narrative when we are not cognizant of what our meta narrative is. What is our shared belief about what human rights are, how they work, and why they matter? And so we also started to try, can we articulate what is that common story we tell around human rights? And we were inspired by work of Anat Shenker-Osorio, a cognitive linguist who's done some research on how we talk. And basically, we looked at the language used in the labs to find here are 3 potential new ways of talking about human rights. So how it works, how not human rights is something that will protect you from harm, but a thing our supporters, those communities, can use to achieve change in their society. So one is that human rights shows us the way forward. It's a roadmap, like rules of the road that we use to treat each other better. Another is human rights as a plan that show like for the better world we want to build. And my personal favorite is this idea of human rights as glue. Human rights is what binds us together in our shared humanity. And that's the idea here is now we wouldn't actually go around showing people like tubes of glue, squirting it at them and sticking them together. But it's about using the language that people need to stick together, that we're connected, that we use language that basically when we make the case for things, we're not saying, well, this is good for the economy, because that's not what drives us. We're saying that we're all human. We should treat each other that way. And so that's also a piece of work that now is something we want to work with all of you on, actually finding ways to test if these meta narratives make sense, and roll them out. The final thing that it points out as well is just what is the actual narrative infrastructure organizations need to build. So it's really key for us that small organizations, even if they can't afford like large research projects or work with creative agencies, you're doing narrative anyway with everything you do, whether you like it or not. And so we want to be, what can you already start doing? First of all, not to do harm, to reinforce negative ideas. And what are the long-term changes we all as a movement need to bring about? I think for me, one thing that really stands out, well, there was the ability to organize, so to have more organizers in our community. Right now, human rights groups are really dominated by lawyers, and that work's crucial, but we also need the organizers to build those communities, but we desperately need the digital marketing infrastructure, people who can do social listening, who can put those targeted ads out, which people like Elizabeth Warren are doing massively. And we feel, so one thing Just Labs wants to do now is bring people together to build that capacity together. The basic point, so here to end with a metaphor, is that seeing our movement a little bit like an orchestra. If we're all playing different music, it's not going to sound that great. But if we're all singing on tune, then it will start to sound a little bit better. And so the key point here is we're all in this room because we share values, we share a view of how the world works. And the first step, we think, to actually making that change is that together we agree on what it is, so that then we can start finding the stories that show that our worldview is actually the right way to see the world.
Thank you, Thomas. Round of applause.